Hey everyone, welcome back. We've got a really interesting deep dive for you today.
Oh, yeah. This should be a good one.
We're going to be talking about Jeffrey Sachs
Right?
and his appearance on the Phidias podcast.
Yep. Yep.
And he had some pretty interesting things to say about Europe and
Yeah.
its role in geopolitics.
He did not hold back.
Yeah, he does not hold back.
No, he's
You know,
he's known for being pretty straightforward
yeah.
and direct with his commentary and analysis.
Yeah, well, let's just jump right in.
Okay, sounds good.
So right out of the gate, Sachs makes this pretty bold claim.
Right.
He says that Europe is being picked to pieces
Wow.
because it
Back
lacks,
to pieces, huh?
yeah, he says it lacks a unified and independent foreign policy.
Interesting.
Yeah,
I mean, that's kind of a provocative way to start, right?
yeah.
Get your attention.
Yeah, and he doesn't just sort of throw that out there. He brings up some pretty compelling examples.
Oh, yeah, he backs it up for sure.
Yeah, so one of them is, and this is sort of
Yeah.
it's kind of an out there
Yeah.
example, but I think it really illustrates his point. He talks about the U.S.,
Yeah.
making a play for Greenland,
Oh, wow.
which sounds,
I mean,
it's kind of crazy.
it's like a what-if scenario.
Right.
But it makes you think.
Yeah, doesn't it?
Exactly. And it really underscores this whole idea that Europe is really reliant on the U.S. for defense, even when it may not be in Europe's best interest.
Exactly. And, it really highlights, I think, the power dynamics at play.
Right.
Europe is kind of in this position where
Yeah.
they're dependent on the U.S. for security,
Yeah.
but at the same time, that dependence might be preventing them from
Right.
fully asserting their own interests
Right.
on the world stage. So,
Right.
yeah, that's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
I mean,
And then he brings up something that's, I think, a little bit closer to home.
okay. And definitely, something that's happened in recent history, and that is the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage,
Right.
which,
Yeah, that was a major event.
yeah, it was. And I think it was kind of a wake-up call for a lot of people.
Absolutely, because it showed just how vulnerable
Yeah.
Europe is and, how little control they have
Yeah.
over their own, energy security, for example.
Right. And just their destiny. I mean, it's just this idea that they're not really in control.
It's like someone else is calling the shots,
Right.
and they're just kind of left to deal with the consequences.
And it really,
Yeah.
he's sort of holding up a mirror
Yeah.
to Europe
I like that analogy.
and saying, hey, you're repeating the mistakes of history.
He actually draws a parallel to the early United States back
Yeah.
when it was just the 13 colonies.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really fascinating comparison.
Yeah. And he's basically saying, look, you guys were this loose confederation
Yeah.
with no real foreign policy.
Yeah, right. No real power to project their interests on the world stage.
Right.
And they got taken advantage of. They got pushed around.
Yeah. They learned the hard way.
They did. They learned the hard way that a weak and divided union is a recipe for disaster.
And his point is
Yeah.
that Europe risks falling into that same trap.
Right. They're fragmented. They're under the influence of the U.S.
Yeah.
And they're not really acting as a unified force.
So if we're following his kind of line of thinking,
Okay.
the core of the problem is that Europe is too divided internally and
Yeah.
too dependent on the U.S. externally.
Okay, so internal divisions, external dependence.
Yeah.
That's the crux of the issue.
But then we have to look at, what's the U.S.'s role in all of this?
Right. What about the other side of the equation?
Yeah. Because Sachs doesn't hold back when it comes to his assessment of U.S. foreign policy.
No, he does not. He's pretty critical
Yeah.
of U.S. foreign policy and its impact on Europe.
Yeah, he's basically arguing that the U.S. has a long track record of putting its own interests first, and that often happens at the expense of its supposed allies in Europe.
Right. So he's saying the U.S. is not always a reliable partner.
Yeah.
And that their actions sometimes undermine
Right.
European interests.
Yeah, and he uses some pretty strong examples to drive this point home.
Oh, yeah. He's got some compelling evidence to back up his claims.
So,
So what are some of these examples?
well, one of the big ones is the expansion of NATO,
Oh, yeah. That's a big one.
which Sachs argues was basically a broken promise to Russia
Okay. So
in a major
a
factor.
broken promise meaning like,
Yeah, this idea that NATO
Yeah.
wasn't going to expand eastward,
right.
And
Interesting.
then they did.
And that contributed to the current conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah, he sees it as a key factor in,
Yeah, it's like a domino effect.
yeah, the tensions
One thing led to another.
that we're seeing in Ukraine.
Interesting.
And he sees this as part of a larger pattern Okay. Of what he calls U.S.-led regime change operations.
Oh, yeah, he's very critical of U.S. interventionism.
And this is where it gets kind of mind-blowing.
Okay, ready?
He claims that there have been like 100 of these operations since World War II.
Wow.
100 times.
That's a pretty startling number.
That the U.S. has tried to reshape governments around the world.
So he's painting a picture of the U.S. as this global puppet master.
Yeah.
Trying to control everything.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And, he brings up examples like Iraq, Libya, Syria to show,
Yeah, those are all pretty controversial interventions.
Yeah, that this is a pattern.
Yeah, a lot of debate about those.
That's been going on.
Yeah, for sure.
For decades.
Okay, so the expansion of NATO, regime change operations.
Yeah.
What else?
Well, and then we can't forget about the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage.
Oh, right. Yeah, he brings that up, too.
Which, he reminds us of Biden's words.
Yeah.
When he said, if Russia invades Nord Stream 2, we'll be finished.
And then it happened. Wow. Talk about foreshadowing.
I know.
It's like he was predicting the future.
Yeah, and what's really unsettling is that, the investigation into that whole incident has been shrouded in secrecy.
Yeah, we still don't really know what happened.
Right, and so Sachs sees that as evidence of Europe's passive acceptance of this act.
Like they're just letting it slide.
Yeah.
Because they're afraid to challenge the U.S.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And then he also points out what he sees as U.S. hypocrisy.
Okay.
Especially when it comes to, like, the UN.
Yeah.
You know how the U.S. will often just disregard.
Yeah, they kind of pick and choose which international rules they want to follow.
The UN, but then criticize other nations for doing the same thing.
Interesting. So he's calling out a double standard.
Yeah.
Okay, so Sachs is laying out a pretty damning critique here.
Yeah.
But he's not just doom and gloom, right?
Right. He's not just a critic.
He's got solutions, too.
He offers an alternative, a vision for a stronger, more independent Europe.
Okay, I like where this is going.
And he calls it grown-up diplomacy.
Grown-up diplomacy. Okay.
Yeah.
I like the sound of that already.
So
what do you mean by that?
What does he mean by that?
What does he mean by that?
Well, he's basically saying that, Europe needs to engage with the world based on realpolitik.
Okay, realpolitik, so a more pragmatic approach.
Yeah, a pragmatic understanding of, power dynamics and national interests.
Okay.
And
so less idealism, more realism.
Exactly.
I got it.
It's about Europe, taking control of its own
shaping its own destiny.
Shaping its own destiny.
Interesting.
And he outlines kind of 3 key pillars of this approach.
Okay, 3 pillars, I'm listening.
So one is strategic autonomy.
Okay, strategic autonomy.
The second is multilateralism.
Mm-hmm.
And the third is direct engagement.
Okay, so strategic autonomy, multilateralism, and direct engagement.
Yeah, those are the 3 pillars of grown-up diplomacy.
All right, let's break those down one by one.
So what is strategic autonomy?
Yeah, what does that actually mean?
Well, in essence, it means that Europe needs to develop its own defense capabilities.
Okay.
Independent of NATO.
So basically, Europe needs to be able to defend itself without relying on the U.S.
Right.
Okay.
Imagine a Europe that can stand on its own 2 feet militarily.
Yeah, that's a pretty big shift from the current situation where they're heavily reliant on NATO.
Okay, so that's strategic economy.
Got it.
What about multilateralism?
Yeah, what does that look like?
Well, multilateralism is about working within the framework of the UN to foster a more just and stable global order.
So cooperation among nations to address shared challenges.
Right. It's about, fostering cooperation among nations to address things like climate change, poverty, conflict, those kinds of things.
Global problems that require global solutions. Yeah.
So it's like, a global town hall where countries can come together.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
Like a global town hall.
To find common ground and work towards solutions.
Okay, so it's about leveraging international institutions to create a more cooperative and rules-based world.
Exactly.
Got it.
Okay, and then the third pill is direct engagement.
Okay, direct engagement.
What does that mean?
What's that all about?
So direct engagement is about Europe taking the initiative to forge its own relationships with major powers like Russia and China.
Okay, so not letting the U.S. dictate their foreign policy.
Right, instead of letting the U.S. kind of call the shots.
Oh, right.
Europe would proactively engage in direct dialogue and diplomacy with these nations to address shared concerns.
So building bridges.
Yeah.
Instead of burning them.
And building more stable relationships.
Okay, so it's about stepping out from under the U.S.'s shadow.
Yeah.
And forging its own path on the world stage.
Exactly.
This grown-up diplomacy.
Yeah.
That Sachs advocates for, it's a pretty bold vision.
It is.
It really is.
It makes you wonder, would everyone agree with this?
That's a great
to
question.
approach?
Because, not everyone shares Sachs' optimistic outlook. There are other perspectives out there.
Yeah.
For example, John Mearsheimer,
Right.
another prominent scholar of international relations,
Right.
he takes a much more pessimistic stance.
Yeah.
He believes that competition between great powers is inevitable.
Right. He's a realist.
Yeah, almost like a law of nature.
Yeah.
It's going to happen whether we like it or not.
But Sachs
Yeah.
is saying, no, we have a choice. We can choose a different path.
Okay.
If we have the will and the wisdom to do so.
So Mearsheimer, the realist,
Yeah.
sees conflict as inevitable.
Right.
Sachs, the idealist,
Right.
believes we can choose a different path.
Exactly.
Okay. But one thing they both agree on
Yeah.
is that the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah.
We're living in a time of profound geopolitical transformation.
Right.
The old rules are being rewritten.
Yeah. And Sachs really believes that Europe is at the epicenter of this shift.
Right. They're kind of at a crossroads.
Yeah.
Facing a pivotal moment.
Yeah.
That will have far-reaching consequences.
For the whole world.
Yeah, it's not just about Europe.
Right. It's about global stability and peace.
Right. The choices they make
Yeah.
will affect everyone.
It's like he's issuing a wake-up call to Europe.
Saying, hey, wake up.
Saying the choices you make now will not only determine your own fate, but also the fate of the world.
It's a big responsibility.
Yeah.
And he's urging them to step up and play a more active and independent role in shaping this emerging world order.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Sachs paints a pretty bleak picture of Europe's current predicament.
Fragmented, vulnerable.
Yeah.
Beholden to the U.S., which often prioritizes its own interests.
Yeah, but he also offers a glimmer of hope.
Yeah.
This path towards a stronger, more independent Europe.
Grown-up diplomacy.
Embracing grown-up diplomacy.
I like that.
What stood out to you the most from this interview?
I think what really struck me were Sachs's insights on the historical parallels between the U.S. and Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a reminder that even powerful nations can make mistakes.
Right.
They can fall victim to internal divisions.
Right.
And strategic blunders.
Yeah, and it really underscores the importance of learning from history.
Absolutely. We can't just repeat the same mistakes over and over again.
Right. And it makes me think about, how we can apply these lessons to our own lives.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, just as Sachs is urging Europe to take ownership of its destiny, maybe we can all benefit from, cultivating a sense of self-reliance and agency in our own lives. Maybe we can all be a little more grown-up.
I love that connection you're making.
Yeah.
It's so true. We can all learn from this idea of being more independent, more strategic in our own lives.
Right.
We don't always have to follow the crowd or accept the status quo.
Yeah.
We can think differently.
Yeah.
We can question assumptions.
Yeah.
And we can forge our own paths.
Absolutely. And sometimes that means, having difficult conversations.
Yeah.
Challenging conventional wisdom.
Right.
And standing up for what we believe in, even when it's uncomfortable
Yeah.
or unpopular.
Taking control of our own narratives.
Yeah.
Embracing personal growth. And striving to make a positive impact on the world around us.
Exactly.
I mean, those are all really valuable takeaways from this conversation.
So to our listeners out there,
we
encourage you to reflect on these ideas.
Think about it.
What resonates with you?
Yeah.
What lessons can you apply to your own life?
Right.
And how do you envision a future where Europe plays a more active and independent role?
It's a question worth pondering.
On that global stage.
Food for thought.
Food for thought.
Sachs' interview is a call to action.
Yeah.
It's urging us to be more engaged with the world.
In a more thoughtful and strategic way. Yeah. It's like he's saying, hey, don't just sit back and watch this happen.
Right.
Be a part of shaping the future.
Be proactive.
Yeah.
Engage with the world.
Yeah, and Sachs really emphasizes the urgency of the situation.
Yeah.
He's not just talking about some abstract, geopolitical maneuvering.
Right.
This is about real people.
This is about the future.
It's about, the future of peace and stability and prosperity for everyone.
Yeah, the stakes are high.
Yeah.
He's basically sounding the alarm.
Yeah.
He's saying Europe needs to wake up.
Yeah.
And make some bold choices.
And I think one of the things that I really appreciated about this interview is that, he lays out this vision for grown-up diplomacy.
Yeah.
But he doesn't pretend to have all the answers.
Right. He's not giving us a step-by-step guide.
Right.
He's raising more questions than he's answering.
Yeah. It's like he's saying, okay, here's the goal.
Right.
Here's what we need to achieve.
But how do we get there?
But how do we get there?
Exactly.
And I think that's really important because it invites us all to be a part of the conversation.
Right. To think critically about these issues.
Right. To figure out, okay, what would it actually look like
Yeah.
for Europe to develop its own defense force?
Right. How do you actually implement these ideas?
Yeah.
And what are the risks?
What are the trade-offs?
Right, because there are always trade-offs.
Yeah, what are the potential downsides of Europe asserting itself more forcefully on the world stage?
Right. Could it backfire?
Could it lead to new conflict?
Could it make things worse instead of better?
Right.
Those are all valid questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately what Sachs is doing is he's throwing down a challenge.
Right.
He's saying, Europe, you have the potential to be a leader,
Right.
but you got to step up.
You got to take charge.
You got to take ownership.
And you got to be smart about it.
Yeah.
You got to think strategically.
And I think, this whole conversation has been really insightful.
It has.
I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
Yeah, there's so much more to explore.
But, Sachs has given us a lot to think about.
He's given us a framework for understanding the challenges facing Europe.
And maybe even some of the challenges facing the world.
And some possible solutions.
And some possible paths forward.
It's a call to action.
Yeah.
To be more informed.
Yeah.
More engaged.
More grown up.
Yeah, more grown up in our approach to global affairs.
So, to our listener out there,
Yeah.
we encourage you to keep exploring these issues.
Don't just take our word for it.
Yeah. Do your own research.
Read Sachs' work.
Yeah.
Read other perspectives.
Think critically.
And come to your own conclusions.
Yeah.
The world is changing.
And we all have a role to play in shaping the future.
That's right.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Take care.